February 1945. A line of American ambulances sat frozen on a narrow road in eastern France, not stuck in mud, not pinned down by German fire, not waiting for engineers to clear a bridge. They were waiting for gasoline. Inside those ambulances were wounded men wrapped in blankets that had already gone stiff with frost. Some had been hit near the Saar. Some had been pulled from shell holes before dawn. One medic kept moving from stretcher to stretcher with a flashlight under his coat, trying to keep the batteries warm enough to work. The drivers had been told fuel was coming. It did not come. 6 hours passed. By the time a recovery truck finally reached them, 2 of the wounded were dead. One of them was a young sergeant from Massachusetts who had survived artillery, machine gun fire, and a German sniper earlier that winter. He did not die because the Germans found him. He died because the gasoline sign to that evacuation column had vanished from the Army's own supply chain. And 3 days later, when the report reached General George S. Patton, he did something nobody in the room expected. He did not shout. He did not throw the file. He read the page once, then he read it again. Then he folded it closed with both hands and smiled so slightly that the officers beside him remembered it for the rest of their lives. Because that was the moment they understood. Somebody in the rear had been stealing from soldiers at the front, and Patton had just decided they were going to learn what the front felt like. By that point, the United States Army was supposed to have the best logistics machine on Earth. Ships crossed the Atlantic with fuel, blankets, meat, cigarettes, morphine, ammunition, spare parts, field telephones, tires, soap, boots, and coffee. Depots in France were stacked with crates so high that men joked the Army could build a second Europe out of cardboard and olive drab paint. On paper, every gallon was counted. On paper, every ration had a destination. On paper, every medical case marked for a field hospital arrived where it belonged. But on the frozen edge of the front, the paper did not match the war. Private Leo Hanley, a rifleman from Cleveland, had spent 4 days in a foxhole with nothing hot in his stomach. His unit had been promised food the day before, then fuel, then dry socks, then a replacement radio battery. Nothing arrived. He blamed the roads. He blamed the weather. He blamed the Germans. He never imagined the missing food was sitting less than 2 miles behind him in a warehouse, being loaded after midnight onto civilian trucks. The men doing the loading were not enemy agents. They wore American uniforms, quartermaster men, clerks, drivers, who knew which crate could disappear without raising questions. Officers who knew how to make paperwork say a shipment had gone forward when it had never left the depot. They sold canned meat to black market dealers. They sold cigarettes by the case. They sold coffee, batteries, blankets, medical kits, and fuel drums. And worst of all, they sold morphine. Not surplus morphine, not damaged morphine. Morphine marked for combat aid stations where men were screaming into blankets because there was not enough pain medication to go around. This was not one greedy sergeant hiding cartons under a tarp. It was a second supply line, a shadow supply line. The official Army supply line ran toward the front. The shadow line ran sideways into villages, warehouses, private accounts, and sealed envelopes passed between men who had discovered something terrible about war. In a big enough army, theft can dress itself as confusion. For months, that confusion protected them. Reports came back from fighting units. Shortages were getting worse. Medical units were rationing drugs. Tank crews were losing vehicles because fuel deliveries arrived late or half empty. Field kitchens were feeding men once when they should have fed them twice. Yet the ledgers at several depots showed normal delivery rates. That was the first impossible fact. More hunger, more shortages, more frozen men at the front, but no missing supplies on paper. Somewhere between the warehouse and the foxhole, the Army was bleeding, and one young clerk had already seen the wound. His name was Corporal Daniel Keene. He was 19 years old from a grocery family in Pennsylvania, and his official job was too boring for most officers to notice. He checked manifests. He counted crates. He copied figures from one form to another until his fingers cramped. That was why the thieves underestimated him. They saw a clerk. They did not see a man raised by a father who counted inventory every Saturday night and could spot a missing case of flour without touching the shelf. Keene noticed small things first. A shipment of canned beef marked delivered to a rifle battalion, even though the trucks had never left the depot yard. Fuel drums listed as damaged, then rolled intact into a barn behind a French cafe. Medical crates stamped for an evacuation hospital, then repainted and loaded onto a truck with no army markings. The first time he reported it, a staff sergeant told him to stop imagining things. The second time, a captain shut the door before speaking. "You are a corporal," the captain said. "You count what you are told to count." The third time, Keene was warned that making false accusations against officers in wartime could destroy his life faster than a German shell. So he stopped reporting, but he did not stop watching. Every night, inside a cold little billet with cracked plaster walls, he opened a pocket notebook and wrote what the official ledgers would not hold. Dates, truck numbers, crate markings, initials on receipts, names of drivers, times of departure, which officer signed, which clerk altered the form, which shipment disappeared. He wrote in tiny script to save space. Then he copied the most dangerous entries twice, because he had no idea whether anyone would ever listen. But he knew what happened when proof existed only in one place. For 7 months he built a map of the shadow supply line. He did it while sleeping 20 feet from some of the men he was documenting. He did it while officers joked about shortages at the front. He did it while men like Leo Hanley waited in foxholes for food that had already been sold. And then the ambulances froze on the road. The report that landed on Patton's desk was supposed to die in the administrative chain. It had been softened before it reached him. The language was careful. The missing gasoline was described as a delivery failure. The dead men were listed as casualties following weather-related evacuation delay. The internal note attached to the file suggested further review after operational pressures allowed. Patton did not care for soft language. He circled 2 phrases in pencil: fuel unavailable, 2 fatalities. Then he wrote 1 word in the margin: why. Within 2 hours, the Inspector General, the Provost Marshal, and the senior legal officer for Third Army were standing in front of him. So were the commanders of the major supply depots under his authority. Men who had grown comfortable with warm offices, clean boots, and the pleasant belief that distance from gunfire meant distance from danger. Patton held up the file. He did not begin with accusations. He began with a question. Who signed the release order for that convoy's gasoline? Nobody answered. A colonel near the back said there may have been confusion in the transfer records. He said the word confusion as if it were a blanket big enough to cover the dead. Patton looked at him. There were men dying in ambulances, he said. Do not offer me confusion. The room went still. He told them the fuel had been allocated. He told them the convoy had been logged as supplied. He told them the gasoline was not there. Then he turned the page and read the names of the 2 dead men aloud. Not ranks, not casualty numbers. Names. The officers listened with the stiff faces of men beginning to understand that this was not a meeting. It was a trap being closed. Patton laid the file flat on the table. Until I know otherwise, he said, I will assume that every man responsible for moving supplies in this army is either honest, incompetent, or guilty. The honest will help me. The incompetent will be removed. The guilty will wish I had removed them. Then he gave the order. No warnings. No quiet interviews. No time for the guilty to burn ledgers, move money, or threaten witnesses. At 300 hours, police and criminal investigators hit the depots at the same time. They entered offices with sealed orders. They locked file cabinets, they seized dispatch books. They woke quartermaster officers out of bed and put guards at the doors before anyone could reach a telephone. Near Nancy, investigators found ration crates stacked behind a false partition in a civilian warehouse. At another, fuel drums had been painted over and marked as agricultural oil. At a third, officers had kept 2 sets of books, one for the army, one for themselves. The official ledger showed clean deliveries. The private ledger showed names, prices, cuts, and destinations. There was Major Ellis Varnum, who had turned medical supplies into cash. There was Colonel Robert Haskell, whose personal account in Switzerland held more money than his salary could have earned in 10 lifetimes. There was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rowe, who had built the network into something larger than theft. Rowe did not steal like a desperate man. He stole like an executive. He had civilian brokers. He had drivers. He had friendly warehouse owners. He had officers who moved forms when forms needed moving. He had enlisted men who learned not to ask why a truck filled with army coffee was leaving a depot at midnight toward a town with no American unit stationed there. He had protection, or he believed he did. Then investigators found Corporal Daniel Keene. Keene was sitting on the edge of a cot when 2 CD agents asked if he had seen anything unusual at the depot. For a moment he did not speak. He looked at the closed door. He looked at the 2 agents. Then he reached inside the lining of his field jacket and removed a notebook wrapped in cloth. His hands were shaking, not because he was afraid of what was in it, because for 7 months he had carried the only copy of a truth powerful men had tried to bury. "I kept it all," he said. The agents opened the book. Dates, truck numbers, crates, false signatures, routes, names, page after page. It did not merely support the evidence from the raids, it explained it. By dawn, Patton had a picture of a criminal machine running inside his army's veins. Dozens of officers implicated, more than 100 enlisted men tied to diversions, food, fuel, medical supplies, and equipment stolen in quantities large enough to change what life felt like at the front. And the worst part was not the money. The worst part was the pattern. Every stolen gallon of gasoline became one truck that did not arrive. Every stolen case of rations became one platoon that fought hungry. Every stolen medical crate became one aid station where a medic had to look a wounded man in the face and say, "I do not have enough." That was what Patton could not tolerate. Not theft as a crime against property. Theft as a crime against the man in the foxhole. The legal officers expected the accused to be arrested, held, and court-martialed through ordinary procedure. Patton had another idea. He wanted the accused officers sent to the front before trial. 7 days, no privileges, no officer comforts, no private rations, no warm headquarters room. They would live with the units whose supplies had vanished. Colonel Henry Worth, the Inspector General assigned to lead the case, objected first. He was not weak. He was careful. He knew military law, and he knew the danger of giving clever defense attorneys a procedural weapon. "Sir," Worth said, "assignment to combat duty before trial may be attacked as punishment before conviction." Patton did not move. "Then call it instruction." "Sir, the court may not appreciate that distinction. The court is welcome to appreciate the dead." A second officer tried to explain that some of the accused had friends in Army Group headquarters. One had a brother-in-law in Washington. Another had served under a general who did not like public scandal. Pressure would come. Patton looked down at the file again. "I have pressure too," he said. "Mine is buried in a military cemetery because a fuel truck never came." The order was written, and the pressure came exactly as predicted. Within 2 days, senior logistics officers were calling. Staff men used polished words like precedent, morale, discipline, process, optics. They said the investigation had to be handled quietly. They said the Army could not afford scandal while crossing into Germany. They said Patton's anger might endanger convictions. Patton heard all of it. Then he moved faster. Major Rebecca Adler, a JAG officer with a reputation for cutting through excuses like wire, built the legal spine of the case in 48 hours. She separated the evidence that came from lawful inspections. She isolated the private ledger. She identified which witnesses needed protection before they could be intimidated or transferred, and she found the sentence that made Patton stop pacing. "General," she said, "the paper trail is stronger than their connections." The accused officers went to the front. Colonel Haskell was sent to an infantry regiment holding a tree line under German observation. On the first night, he learned that a foxhole is not a place. It is a body position. You fold into it. You shake in it. You sleep in pieces. The sergeant assigned near him had been fighting since Normandy. He knew who Haskell was before Haskell opened his mouth. Patton had made sure of that. By the second day, the unit's hot food did not arrive. The sergeant handed Haskell a cold ration tin and said, "Sometimes it comes, sometimes it disappears." "You probably know more about that than I do." Haskell said nothing. On the third day, a young private was hit by shell fragments during a German probe. The medics got him into a shallow aid pit. They had bandages. Not enough. They had morphine. Not enough. Haskell watched the medic break one dose into less than a dose, trying to make mercy stretch. The wounded private kept asking why it hurt so much. The medic did not answer. Haskell did, not out loud, inside his own skull. Because some of that morphine had passed through his depot, he had signed for it, he had watched it leave. He had taken a percentage, and until that moment managed to keep the crime in the language of inventory. Cases, lots, shortages, irregularities. Now it had a face. 19 years old. Mud on one cheek. Teeth clenched around a strip of cloth. Haskell turned away. Then he turned back. Because turning away did not unmake what he had done. When he returned to headquarters 4 days later, he asked to speak to Worth alone. He gave names for 3 hours. He did not ask for mercy. He asked to make a statement at trial. Major Varnum came back different too. He had spent his week with a tank unit that lost a vehicle when a fuel delivery arrived 40% short. The crew destroyed the tank before withdrawing so the Germans could not capture it. Varnum stood in the snow and watched the flames climb through the turret. A lieutenant with oil on his face looked at him and said, "The Army always says the fuel exists somewhere." Varnum stopped eating after that, but Marcus Rowe came back unchanged, still clean where he could manage it, still correct in his language, still insulted that anyone would confuse his conduct with common crime. He told Adler during questioning that wartime economies always produce leakage. He said goods moved where demand existed. He said officers had always found ways to supplement inadequate pay. He said the Army was choosing scapegoats to protect itself from embarrassment. Adler listened until he finished. Then she opened the ledger. "Your name appears 17 times, she said. "Would you like to explain the leakage line by line?" Rowe smiled, not Patton's thin smile, a colder one, the smile of a man who still believed systems protect the right people. For a week, he was almost right. Attorneys moved, friends called, congressional offices sent inquiries. A staff officer in Washington suggested that the investigation might be damaging to public confidence. There were arguments about illegal searches, command influence, pre-trial punishment, and the danger of exposing corruption while American families still believed the supply system was a miracle of the war. Patton understood the strategy. They were not trying to prove innocence. They were trying to buy time. Time for witnesses to move. Time for records to vanish. Time for the war to swallow the scandal. So he gave them no time. The first court-martial opened in a requisitioned municipal building in early March. Patton chose a room large enough for observers from combat units. Infantrymen, tankers, medics, drivers. Men who had spent the winter living with the consequences of someone else's profit. He wanted them to see the rear answer to the front. Haskell pleaded guilty, then he asked to speak. The room expected excuses, childhood pressure, confusion, bad subordinates, good intentions twisted by war. Haskell offered none of it. He described the beginning of the scheme as a small theft nobody stopped, then a larger theft made easier by the first, then a set of habits, then a system. He named officers who had used rank like a locked door. He named brokers who had paid cash for medical supplies while aid stations rationed pain. Then he described the private in the aid pit. His voice almost broke on the word morphine. "I spent months telling myself these were army supplies," he said. "I did not let myself say they were soldiers' supplies. That was how I slept." He looked at the men in the room. "I know now exactly who I stole from." Haskell was sentenced to hard labor, loss of rank, forfeiture of pay, and dishonorable discharge. The guards did not salute when they led him away. Varnum fought. Adler brought the ledger. She brought drivers. She brought depot clerks. She brought hospital records showing shortages in the same weeks his depot had received the missing drugs. She did not claim to know exactly which man died because Varnum sold morphine into the black market. She said something worse. "We cannot put one name beside every stolen vial," she told the court. "But we can prove wounded soldiers went without it while this officer sold it." The room did not move. Varnum was convicted on every major charge. Before transfer to prison, Patton assigned him to Graves registration duty for 6 months. No ceremony, no speech, just the work, finding American bodies, wrapping remains, learning the final weight of men he had once reduced to numbers. Rowe's trial lasted the longest. He challenged everything, the raids, the witnesses, the ledger, the authority, the motives. He suggested Keene had misunderstood routine paperwork. He suggested enlisted men had invented testimony for immunity. He suggested Patton had poisoned the process by wanting him guilty before the court began. Adler let him build the argument. Then she dismantled it receipt by receipt. Keene took the stand on the 4th day. He looked younger than the crimes around him. His uniform did not fit quite right at the shoulders. His voice shook at first. Rowe's attorney tried to make him look small, a clerk, a frightened boy, a corporal who resented officers. Keene answered each question by opening his notebook. Truck 81 Thurn, February 2nd, 16 fuel drums. Signed out by Lieutenant Ames under Rowe's authority. Listed as delivered to a tank maintenance point. Actually loaded behind Warehouse 4 at N15 hours. Driven by Sergeant Bellamy. Civilian broker present. Cash packet passed to Captain Lyle. The lawyer asked if he could prove that. Keene turned to the next page. I wrote down the license plate of the civilian truck. That was the moment the courtroom changed. Not because Keene was dramatic, because he was exact. The shadow supply line had survived on blur. Keene had killed it with detail. Rowe was convicted of theft, conspiracy, falsifying records, witness intimidation, and obstruction. He received the harshest sentence. Patton ordered the verdict distributed throughout Third Army, not as gossip, as a warning. A commander could hide behind distance from the front, only until the front was brought back to him. By the end of March, the numbers had changed. Not perfectly, not magically, but visibly. Emergency shortages dropped across the units Patton's staff tracked most closely. Medical officers reported steadier deliveries. Fuel allocations began matching what actually arrived. Random audits caught smaller thefts before they became networks. Dual signatures became mandatory on high-value shipments. Enlisted men were given protected channels to report suspicious movement without sending the complaint through the very officer they suspected. That reform mattered more than the punishments. Patton knew it, even if the newspapers preferred the punishments, because shooting anger through a corrupt system feels satisfying for a moment. Changing the system is what prevents the next theft. Corporal Daniel Keene was promoted before the war in Europe ended. He spent the final months training other clerks and inspectors to read logistics like a crime scene. Not one missing crate, but patterns. Not one bad receipt, but repeated impossibilities. Not one rumor, but a chain of physical proof. He had never planned to become an investigator. He had simply refused to let the truth remain undocumented. After the war, he went home, studied accounting, and spent much of his life auditing government contracts. He rarely talked about France. His children knew he kept an old notebook in a metal box, but they did not know why until decades later. Inside were the small pencil lines that had helped expose a machine larger than any one thief. Dates, trucks, names, numbers. The quiet handwriting of a man who had no authority, no protection, and no guarantee that anybody powerful would ever care. That is the part most people miss when they tell stories about generals. They remember the famous man at the desk, the sharp order, the raids, the trials, the ruined officers. And all of that happened because authority finally moved. But authority did not discover the truth first. A clerk did. A 19-year-old corporal saw what colonels refused to see, wrote what captains tried to scare him out of writing, and kept doing it long enough for the facts to survive the men who wanted them dead. The frozen ambulances on that road became the breaking point. Patton gave the investigation force. Adler gave it a legal spine. Worth gave it procedure. But Keene gave it memory. Without the notebook, the thieves might have blamed confusion. They might have blamed weather. They might have blamed war. With the notebook, every excuse had a date, a truck number, and a signature beneath it. That was why the black market inside Third Army did not collapse because one general was angry. It collapsed because one honest man had stopped being alone. And in a war where entire armies moved on paper, a pencil in the right hand became more dangerous than a loaded gun.